A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
It might be sobering to appreciate the estimate that there are as many as 50 million people in slavery around the world today, and our special guest is the founder of an anti-human trafficking organisation. He says this Christmas, thousands of young women in Nepal face the heartbreaking threat of being taken from their families and trafficked across borders. If you have a daughter, you might appreciate that daughters are important. And Ross Nancarrow, our guest over this next hour, is founder and CEO of the organisation Every Daughter Matters, an anti-human trafficking organisation. It brings awareness of human trafficking in Australia, and this month they're intercepting and rescuing more than 100 young women on the Nepal-India border. Ross is a passionate advocate for human rights and anti-modern day slavery. Ross, I might say a special welcome along to 2020.
Hi Neil, it's great to be with you today, and great to be able to share with your listeners some of the things that are happening in modern day slavery and human trafficking.
Well, Ross, let's jump straight into the deep end here, because the place where Every Daughter Matters works is on the busiest human trafficking gateway in the world, a more than 1,700 kilometre border between Nepal and India. And when you talk busy human trafficking gateways, this is busier than perhaps we can all get our head around. But take us into what happens with the work of Every Daughter Matters on that border.
Sure. So it is a hugely busy human trafficking highway. There's about at least 20,000 to 25,000 girls trafficked every year across that border. And it's opportunistic. It's people taking advantage of young women and girls from Nepal and trafficking them into India, into organ trafficking, sex industry, and slave labour. So we've set up border surveillance interception booths at some of the busiest border crossings between Nepal and India. And at those crossings, we have between 3 and 5 staff, and they are there really to look out for and intercept young women who are being trafficked.
Okay, now I guess they're, highly trained, streetwise people that you've got there at those borders and looking out for particular people who might be fitting the description, or is there a sort of a profile of young women who are coming through and that many of them are being sort of duped into taking sort of false advertised jobs and things like that? So I imagine that sort of streetwise, on the lookout, you can identify, is there a certain look about these young women?
Absolutely. And first of all, our staff there, they are highly trained. A number of them actually have been trafficked themselves or been rescued from being trafficked. And so they've got a beautifully attuned, and I'll call it, a BS meter, to understand what they're looking at and to ask the right questions and to see through some of the deceptions and the lies of the things that they come across. So they literally stop traffic. They literally are looking out for girls who are maybe showing signs of being vulnerable or being nervous. Maybe they're with people that are the wrong kind of people, or a young girl with somebody older. Really, they'll stop any of the young women who are coming through that border. I was in Nepal in September, and we saw it firsthand. We were on the border, and we saw our staff and the organisation we work with firsthand. One of the particular border crossings, a young man and a girl were taken to the booth where we have our interception partners there, and they started to be questioned, and you could see that the realization coming to this girl's face the further the questioning went on. And it was then understood that she'd been groomed for more than a year on Facebook. And the young man with her, you could see he knew he was in trouble. The police were right beside us. They were brought into the situation. And again, you just see this look on this girl's face. Oh my gosh, I was actually about to be trafficked. And the realization that the dream she had for what she thought was a love marriage was now shattered. And but the good news was she was being rescued from being actually sold into human trafficking in India. We saw it firsthand now.
A love marriage or promises to find a job as a domestic worker, and as I understand it, either in India or in some of the Gulf countries, and India would be the way that they would move there. But a 12-month period of grooming that happens online, and it's like a recruitment. And, as you say, the relief that must come on her face when that's exposed, because take us into, what the human trafficking, modern day slavery looks like, because we're talking about here young women being raped in brothels in these countries. So give us an impression here of what they're headed for if they're not rescued at the border.
Sure. Well, I'll try and be careful at the time factor on what I'm speaking about and sensitive to it, because some of the stories are horrific. We've heard stories of girls who are duped, they then drugged or subdued. They'll wake up in a clinic and find that their one kidney is gone. This particular girl I'm thinking about was then raped. She had a baby and was then sold to a brothel in Delhi. She was told she could see her child if she fulfilled her quota. Now, this is, and she would be, of course, beaten or tortured if she did not fulfill a quota, and it was held over her head that, that's the only way she would see her child. And we're talking of this girl being raped 20, 30 times a day, and that's life for some of these girls. And then when they're used up, they're sold into, slave labor. And we know that 2 to 3% of the girls, once they're across that border, are rescued after that. 2 to 3%. And that's horrific. The life for these girls, the things that they're being saved from, is astounding. And we know it, Neil. We see it. And we see it in the eyes of the girls who have been rescued, who've been in that situation. And we know that what we're doing in the interception part of this is the best thing we can possibly do before the damage is done.
So, never returned to their families, as you say, when they're used up, sold into slave labour beyond their use-by date in a brothel. They don't get holidays. You don't just sort of get to ring your family and say, I'm going to be home for Christmas. It just doesn't work like that. So really, if one of these organisations gets these young women across the border, that's literally the end. Is that just bluntly the way it is?
Pretty much. I mean, some of the girls are rescued, that's for sure, and we thank God for that. There's another aspect to this, and that's the shame component. If these girls have been involved in prostitution or been used in brothels in this way for a period of time, there's a shame component, and it's too hard to go back to family. They're not accepted necessarily into the communities that they came from. And therefore, after a period of time, for many of these young women, it's like it's too hard now, so they don't go home. They might, if they can escape from a brothel or whatever they've been sold into, they may go to another part of a community in India, but they won't go home. Or they'll continue in prostitution because that's now what they know.
What about the families of these young women? Now, when I said the name of the ministry that you lead, Ross, Every Daughter Matters, there's a message in there for families. But what about the families of these young women? They probably also had this stars in their eyes idea that their daughter was going off to work in some sort of exotic country and going to have a career, maybe working in domestic duties, which at least were going to give an income for some people live in very poor countries. But the families, how do they cope with the fact that their daughter is gone forever?
Wow, Neil, that's such a big question. Let me tell this brief story. When my daughter Katie went to university, I live in Port Macquarie. When she went to university in Lismore, my wife and I took her up and got her all prepared, and we were just overjoyed that she was going to uni, and we dropped her off. And I tell you, I cried all the way home. It's my only daughter, and leaving her and her leaving home, I literally cried all the way home. I think of the fathers in Nepal. I think of the mothers in Nepal. I think of them, some of them, their daughter has come to them and said, I've got the promise of a job. I've got the promise of possible good education. We can move out of poverty. I can send money back to the family. And of course, the family are behind them, and many of them, they're happy for them to go and to take up this great opportunity, similar to my daughter going to university. And then they disappear. And then they're gone. And we know what these families feel like, because so many of the interceptions that we make at the border, we then, our counsellors and our border staff, phone the families and inform them of what's happened to their daughter. And they're so relieved. They're so grateful. They say, please keep us safe. Keep us safe till I get there. And then they'll travel. It may only be a couple of 100 kilometres, but it'll take them a couple of days to get down to our emergency accommodation shelters and to be reunited with their daughters. And Neil, again and again and again, I'm reading these stories of when the family came down, they were overwhelmed with gratitude that their daughter was now safe.
So
now they're the ones that are rescued.
In that sense then, Ross, your organisation is the organisation that's delivering the good news to these families. Yeah. That their daughter Absolutely. Has been rescued, and they may never have seen their daughter again, but Absolutely. You're delivering the good news, and that family so relieved, undoubtedly. And when I mentioned this month that your team is there and you're likely to be rescuing 100 young women through this month, is this a busy time of year for this sort of human trafficking recruitment? Is this particular time of year?
It's actually an average time of year in terms of the numbers that we'll see come through. We intercept actively between 100 to up to 150 every single month of the year. This year, our campaign, Bring Her Home for Christmas, is one where we're looking for funding, of course, to make a difference and to provide the funding necessary to be able to intercept the girls on the border there. So it's our Christmas campaign, but the numbers, this is normal. This is normal. This is every single month we're seeing these kind of numbers of girls being intercepted.
Life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
And our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. You might have your own insight to offer or your own expression, a way you'd like to even connect with Ross Nancarrow, our guest. He's the founder and CEO of Every Daughter Matters, and they're busy with their organisation and really, I guess, dealing with just a small number of young women amongst the 25,000 every year trafficked across the busiest human trafficking gateway, which is a 1,700-kilometre border between Nepal and India. But young women who are responding to opportunity to go off and find themselves a career, and then they are duped into being involved in human trafficking, working in brothels, being raped, tortured, even having their organs harvested. I mean, it's a dreadful circumstance to be able to even contemplate. As we think of Christmas this year and our own families, perhaps a thought for the families that are losing their daughters this Christmas season. Ross Nancarrow, let me just bring into our conversation now Australians, because Aussies have a very poor reputation when it comes to issues around human trafficking. Some of the biggest users of women in Southeast Asia and perhaps other parts of the world as well. What's your impression when we think of Aussies here? Not trying to beat up on Aussies, but just this is the reality.
It is a reality, Neil, and unfortunately Aussies have been identified as significant participants in sex industry or sex tourism within Southeast Asia. There was a report done in 2012 by United Nations that recognised 31% of sex tourists prosecuted in Thailand were Aussies. And they were among the largest group of foreign offenders within the country, so much so that it actually prompted one of our staff members to start the organisation 31 Down, to bring that 31% down and to bring awareness of what is happening. We now have a program where we go into schools and we try to educate young people, particularly young men, that when they go on that school trip or that footy trip to Asia, don't think those pretty girls in those bars are there necessarily because they want to be there. So there's a huge issue there for Aussies in that area.
Sex tourism. And, I guess when you're on a holiday visit, you're letting your hair down. And as you say, you're going into a bar and there are attractive young women there. They're not there of their own accord. Some of those will have been, as we might even just say, stolen from their families and forced to work in those circumstances. Puts a whole new light on the thought of those young women in those bars.
Absolutely. Those pretty smiling faces there because they're forced. It's not necessarily real. The reality is not that they want to be there or they want to do what they are doing. Both in Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, these are all prominent destinations for Aussies. And often child, sex trafficking or sex offenders are involved in all of those countries and travelling for that reason.
We were talking a little bit about the promise of a love marriage a little earlier. Yeah. And, one of the things that young women are groomed for, and, we might all know someone who's married to someone from Southeast Asia and probably quite legitimately, but some of those obviously not legitimate because people are using that platform to be able to recruit these young women. So there's some challenges here. Young women and the promise of a love marriage. In other words, if you're living in a poor family environment, marrying someone from overseas who might have, might even be considered to be rich by those standards. Take us into what happens here with young women and the promises of love marriage.
Sure. So there's a couple of aspects to this. Firstly, within Nepal, the culture there is arranged marriages. And so that's often to secure the future of the family, secure finances for the family, or secure the family being able to go ahead and to move positively ahead financially. However, there's also a society that can be polygamous. So the 18, 20-year-old girl being arranged to marry the 50-year-old guy down the road, he may want a second younger wife who will keep his bed warm and work in his fields. She then goes on Facebook and finds somebody who starts to groom her closer to her own age, and he starts to speak of Bollywood dreams. It's every girl's dream to marry somebody for love, to marry somebody for purposes they want to be married and want to feel secure in. And that's what's used in Nepal so often to lure girls across that border. Closer to home, we've got within Australia approximately 41,000 people in modern-day slavery situations. The areas that have been identified in that are arranged marriages where girls are used because they've got Australian citizenship, can bring somebody else in and then they're used in that way. Maybe it's financial with the girls in that day slavery in Australia. The arranged marriage sector that goes into big business, sometimes farms, sometimes construction, and then, of course, organised crime, who bring girls in under visas for so-called study purposes or whatever, and then put them in the brothels across Australia. All of those things, Neil, are happening in Australia today.
Some of us might be just shocked, maybe exposed for the first time, the thought that young women who have a Bollywood dream, the dream of a romantic marriage, because the culture is that of arranged marriages. And so you might imagine this is very widespread across a lot of these nations. When arranged marriages is the culture, that's expected, that you're going to have to marry someone that your parents have already pre-designated for you. So the thought of the romantic Bollywood dream, that's got to be there fresh in probably the minds of nearly every young woman. So does that make it very, significant that there would be a very large number of young women who'd be very vulnerable to this sort of grooming?
Absolutely. And in Nepal, that area of arranged marriages and escaping that constitutes a large part of the girls, or a large number of the girls who are being trafficked across the border. You know, the saddest thing is when you get to, you know, intercept a girl on the border and she says, I'm meeting a guy in Delhi. He loves me. We've been in relationship, albeit via Facebook for the last 6 months, 12 months, whatever. We're going to get married. And then our staff will ring that guy and he says, I don't know her. I don't know who you're talking about. And she goes, but her dream has been shattered right there on the border. And they want the dream now. And you don't blame women for wanting the dream. You don't blame them for wanting the dream of an education or a good job or a love marriage. These are the things that we take for granted within Australia, but in other parts of the world where poverty has come in, where desperation is a part of the lives of these girls, it's a whole different story. So they'll clutch at any straw they can get. A love marriage, that's fantastic. Yeah.
Ross, do we know how big some of these human trafficking organisations are? Because if this grooming is so widespread and the numbers just huge, how big are some of these trafficking organisations, or is there a little known about them because they're very secretive?
Yeah, well, there's both. There's both the organised organisations and organised crime areas like that. In Nepal, mostly it's opportunistic. So people know that girls, Nepali girls who are naive or vulnerable, they're attractive, they have a beautiful disposition, a quiet disposition and temperament. Those girls are valuable to the traffickers because they're easily subdued and they're easily deceived. So opportunistically, there'll be somebody from India, and we know of traffickers who come from India to Nepal, and women. They'll come there and stay there for a number of months. They will troll through Facebook and find vulnerable girls and then offer them jobs and education within India and then take them across the border and sell them. It may be a family member, although that's not as common in Nepal, but it may be an extended family member, an uncle or a cousin or somebody like that. It could be somebody a girl works with in a village, and they say there's opportunities across the border because they know if they can lure that girl across the border, they can make a lot of money off her. And so the opportunistic stuff.
Hey, Ross, when we talk about this, come back to what's happening at a typical interception. You've got your team. They're on the borders. They're streetwise. They're highly trained. They know what to look for. And they're rescuing these young women, and it would be the last time they'd ever see their family again if they're trafficked across the border. Take us into this typical type of interception that happens.
Absolutely, Neil. You know, there's probably four major areas of that, and the first part of an interception is having the right people on the border. That is, the people who know what to look for, who are able to connect in with the local police, with local businesses or other organisations on the border who are also supporting anti-human trafficking. Having the right staff there is number one. And they're skilled, they do, as you said, they know exactly what to look for. The second part is monitoring and profiling. So they literally go into traffic and they look at the flow of travellers. They look specifically for young women travelling alone or unfamiliar with their companions they're with, individuals who may appear confused or frightened or unsure of their destination. Discrepancies in personal stories or inconsistencies in details about travel plans, jobs, companions, all of those things, they're the questions that begin. And of course, it starts as non-threatening conversations to gather more and more information. Then we move to the intervention, the third part. If suspicions arise, our staff have legal permission to stop anybody, to speak directly to the women in question, to validate their identity, their purpose for travel, their destination, and who their companions are. They provide information on the dangers of employment scams and exploitation, things like that. Okay, now we're up to the point where trafficking is suspected. And at that point, the authorities are close by and they're notified, they're brought into the situation immediately. The authorities will then also verify travel documents, verify the stories of the young girls or whatever's happening. And women who are identified at risk are offered immediate emergency accommodation and shelter, support in a safe location, counselling about safe alternatives, and the traffickers are detained by the border police. We then pursue the traffickers to seek prosecution of traffickers if we're able to, capture any of the traffickers there, or the local police capture
Ross,
them.
when we think of the numbers here, your organisation, which I might say is, there might be a number of organisations working in these different areas around the world, but even in your organisation alone, 3, 4 or 5 times a day, if we're talking 100, 150 a month, 3 or 4, 5 young women every day being rescued on the border. The numbers are amazing.
Yeah, they are. They're staggering, Neil. And that's the good news. To be involved in anti-human trafficking, and I have to say, I never imagined that I would be involved in anti-human trafficking. In all of my years, I never imagined that I'd be doing this at this point. And we hear some horrific stories. But the good news, the thing that gets me out of bed, the thing that keeps me going, is that today, between 3 and 5 girls will be intercepted because of the work that we are doing. These 3 to 5 girls' lives today, their lives will be changed. They'll be given options and hope. Not only do we have emergency accommodation, we've got safe homes where we can, for a limited number of girls, offer 6 months education, education on human rights, legal rights, sewing, life skills, how to manage a business, and then we set girls up into a small micro enterprise project and help them get a good job or get some employment locally. That's the good news.
Now, I imagine that with a 1,700 plus kilometre border between Nepal and India, there must be lots of border crossing points, and you're manning some of those.
Yep.
I guess, ultimately when we get to a conversation here and say, well, how do you double that? 3 or 5 young women today will be rescued. How do we make that 6 or 10 tomorrow? I mean, is it a matter of, is it a funding thing, or how does it work when it comes to the team that you've got doing that amazing work on the border?
Neil, it largely is a funding thing. At the front line, like right on that border, just if we look at in location, it costs about $187 per rescue. We've now got 13 border surveillance interception booths along that border. However, there are 35 border crossings between Nepal and India, and they're the known crossings. They're the road crossings. There's huge numbers of other crossings as well. So we're able to hit on those ones. Yes, to expand, it takes finances. It takes a lot of money to keep this sort of an organisation going, both with the staff in Australia and also the staff that we have in Nepal. We'd have about 50 staff in Nepal. In Australia, we operate, on a shoestring budget, and we get by. We know what we do. We're very careful with what we do, but it just takes funding.
What about the thing that motivates you, Ross, and motivates the people who you've got working for you, those teams on those border crossings? Yes, of course, there's the humanitarian aspect, but is there a faith element that you're able to reflect on when it comes to what motivates you to jump in and be a part of this sort of work?
Absolutely. This is what Jesus would do. This is what Jesus would want to do. Certainly the humanitarian aspect of it, but the faith component comes when I look into the eyes of these girls, when we visit a safe home, and it's a poignant moment. We see these girls and we look into their eyes when they first come in, and then we see them 6 months later after they've received training and understanding of what is happening in the world and what's happening in their life, and we see light in their eyes. We see an understanding that there's something more in life, that they're actually created not to be sold as if they're a commodity, but they're created for purpose. And, I just see Jesus all over this. I just see the words of Jesus. I see the ministry of Jesus. I see the things that Jesus would want to do within society to give people freedom and hope and life. Yeah, we see the faith all over it.
And so many of those listening to our conversation today will have a special focus. It could be evangelism. It could be, on media. It could be in all sorts of different ministry aspects, prison ministry, all sorts of things like that. It's part of our conversation a little bit later on. But to be involved in the rescue of young women like this, because when we think of the reputation that Australians have, a very poor reputation as some of the biggest users of women in Southeast Asia, wouldn't it be amazing if we as Aussies had the reputation of being one of the biggest contributors to the rescue of these young women when they're sold into this sort of slavery? There's a long path to tread. You're in a growth industry, and need to see some growth too with the support of the good work you're doing.
Yeah. Now you're talking, Neil, and I love that, because I think just as much as Aussies have been such a part of it in Southeast Asia, we can be a part of the solution. Not so long ago I was talking to a men's group, and as I looked around this room of 30, 40 men, I was just so thrilled that these men were so on board and wanting to do something to stop the abuse of women, to stop the degradation of women, and to stop the attitude that women are a commodity. And men in Australia, step up. We can do this. We can together use people power and make such a massive difference in this country. So you're absolutely right. And Australians are leading the way. We've got a great reputation in Nepal. That's a country that Aussies don't go to for the sex industry so much. But we've got a good reputation of being caring and wanting to change and wanting to bring hope there.
And while I said earlier not wanting to beat up on Aussies, and never our intention, but to state the facts, that's an important element. I have had conversations similar to the sorts of ones we're having today, Ross, around the thought that even when, wages go up in some of these Southeast Asian nations, then the sex trade increases, and the amount of demand there is for sex within those nations, that increases. Some of that you might put down to as internal sex trafficking within those nations. But when we talk about the sort of the work that you do, you're actually not just saving someone from being trafficked across a border. You're saving a life. You're saving a family. This is a little bit different to what happens internally, but this is something that you can literally be a supporter of the salvation of a person from being lost to their family. The magnitude of it is staggering.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, Neil. And, we feel the weight of that. We feel the weight and the responsibility of what we carry in this space. And as I said earlier, you don't get involved in this and walk away unscathed. You cannot. You find yourself, as I'm in Nepal, I'm there 2 to 3 times a year for about a month each time. And so we spend a lot of time with the people we are rescuing and a part of. Their lives, we see what's changing in their life, we hear the horrific stories, and I'll be honest, there's been times where I've had to step back, coming back from Nepal, and recognize a certain post-traumatic stress and find quiet spaces to deal with that. But I'm so grateful. I can't tell you how grateful I am to be able to do what we do and to be able to move into this space. But it's not just me, it is a whole team of people, both in the staff that we have, but in the supporters. We invite interception partners to join us. We recognise interception partners as those who regularly contribute to rescuing girls in Nepal. And we look for those partners, and by God's grace, we've got many interception partners with us, but we need a lot more so we can extend the work.
Ross, can you take Aussies who are passionate about this as you are, can you take them to Nepal? Can you introduce them to what's happening there on the border, so that those, that understanding of the rescue can, people can have a first-hand experience of that? Have you got that sort of thing worked out yet, or is that something for the future?
We have certainly taken different visitors with us there, but again, it's such an interesting place. As you go to those border locations, it's not simple, it's not straightforward. You're in a place where there's hustle and bustle and there's people coming and going, but there's also hundreds and hundreds of people on the fringes, and they're all looking. Now, you turn up as white Aussies and you stand out, like a sore thumb, and people start to wonder, what are you doing? Who are you? What are you about? And you start to attract a lot of attention, and let's say unwanted attention, very, very quickly. So we're not able to take many people at all to those border locations and do what we do. Even when I go there, for example, I'll stay on the border for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and get out of the way. And we need to do that to enable our Nepali staff to do what they're doing.
And there's 3 to 5 young women every day being rescued. Hey, talk about poverty for a few moments here, because it's going to be nations that are more significantly steeped in poverty that are going to be the fishing pond for those traffickers. Poverty is a challenge. 38% of the population in Nepal living below the poverty line. It means there's going to be more and more people looking to traffic those young women just because there's a poverty issue there. Any thoughts here from you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's estimated that 38% of the population of Nepal live below the poverty line, and that makes the country incredibly vulnerable there. Poverty is one of the leading drivers of human trafficking in Nepal and around the world. It creates vulnerabilities that traffickers love to exploit and things like that. Many women from the poor households are disproportionately affected. 71% of all trafficking victims globally from impoverished families. And here's a stat for you. 1 in 3 trafficking victims is a child, often trafficked for labour and sexual exploitation in poverty-stricken areas. Poverty is a huge driver. And unfortunately, we've got scumbags who take advantage of that, and they're on the lookout and will exploit people who are impoverished all the time.
That's right. Let's name that. Scumbags who are on the lookout to exploit the impoverishment of people here. From what I understand, $150 billion a year worldwide industry in this sex trafficking, and girls making up 71% of all modern slavery victims. Girls are right in the middle of it, and as you say, once they're past their use-by date in the brothels, they're moved on to other dreadful things, into slavery, never seeing their families again. Ross, the sorts of campaigns that you're running, and you run a whole bunch of different campaigns. You've got one called Bring Her Home for Christmas. How can listeners really get behind what you're doing? There might be some who are thinking, well, maybe 2025, I'm going to turn over a new leaf. I'm setting some new goals here at the end of 2024. Maybe I'll get involved in this and try and make a difference wherever I can with a small contribution. Tell us about this campaign you've got running.
Yeah, it's a great campaign, and one of our staff thought of this slogan, Bring Her Home for Christmas. And let me tell you what it evokes. It evokes this girl who's hits a border crossing, and she's able to be intercepted by one of our partners. And how do we do that? How do we accomplish that? And what's the next step of that? So, of course, we make sure the circumstances at home are good. But if we can get her back to her family, and facilitate that in a positive way, that's what we really want to. That's where the campaign came from, and that's what we desire to do this Christmas. We'd love to see funding for at least 100. If I could double that this Christmas, we would, and we'd just flow it into January, February to continue funding the work that we do. $187 is all it takes on the front line to intercept a girl. We've had some of our supporters say we want to give a gift to somebody else and dedicate that gift as a bring her home for Christmas gift, a girl in Nepal for somebody here in Australia. And that's a great Christmas present. If, we facilitate cards and different things for that. We ask people to go to our website, everydaughtermatters.org.au, and all of the details are there on our giving page.
Well, a great goal to double the funding and double the number of young women who are saved and rescued from human trafficking at those borders on the busiest border crossing in the world, busiest human trafficking gateway. That 1,700 kilometre border between Nepal and India that we've been talking about today. And for listeners to connect with Ross Nancarrow, Ross is the founder and CEO of Every Daughter Matters, an anti-human trafficking organisation bringing awareness to this human trafficking here in Australia. Here's the website address. Ross mentioned it, everydaughtermatters.org.au, and they do have their Bring Her Home for Christmas campaign that's running right now. Perhaps you've got some contribution that you can make towards that. Ross Nancarrow, thank you so much for taking some time just to share the facts and your heart, and driven by your passion for following Christ. And I'm just impressed, and just special honour to you, Ross. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today on 2020.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I'm so just grateful for the opportunity and to be able to encourage other Aussies to be involved in stopping human trafficking. We can do that. We can stop it. We can interrupt it. We can join together, and we can make a difference. And thank you for that opportunity.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.